She bought a used dresser at a yard sale, nothing fancy, just old wood and brass handles. But when a strange noise came from the bottom drawer, and she found a hidden compartment tucked behind velvet lining, everything changed. Inside wasn't just treasure, it was a forgotten legacy, a journal, 7 gold coins, and a message meant to be found by someone just like her. If you've ever believed that small things hold big meaning, this emotional story might stay with you long after the video ends. Before we dive in, if stories mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. You never expect a quiet Sunday morning to change your life. But that's exactly what happened to Charlotte Ellenwood, a 38-year-old substitute teacher living in the sleepy town of Millers Creek, Ohio. She wasn't looking for adventure. She wasn't chasing a mystery. She was just trying to find a new dresser for the guest room in her late mother's house. That house had been empty for 6 months now. The air still smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. Most of the rooms were the same as they'd always been: quiet, sunlit, and just a little too big for one person to care for. Charlotte had been driving past the Henson family's yard sale on Maple Avenue when she spotted it. A tall, slightly scuffed oak dresser. 5 drawers. Brass handles dulled with age. It wasn't beautiful. Not in the conventional sense, but there was something about it that felt honest, like it had belonged somewhere important. She asked the teenage boy managing the sale how much. $15, he said, chewing gum. It's heavy, though. Charlotte smiled. Aren't all the best things? They loaded it into the back of her Subaru with some effort. And by noon, it was sitting in her mother's old guest room against the faded floral wallpaper, beneath a window that hadn't been opened since spring. That night, after dinner, Charlotte decided to wipe it down. She ran a cloth along the edges, polished the knobs with lemon oil. The drawers were empty, save for a few wood shavings and a single yellowed button that had slipped behind a corner seam. Then, as she opened the bottom drawer, she heard it. A faint clunk. Not a loose screw, not the wood settling. It was hollow, sharp, like something had shifted inside the frame. She tapped gently along the inner wall of the drawer. Thud, tap, tap, hollow, and then click! The bottom lining of the drawer gave way just slightly. Not much, but enough for her to grip the edge with her fingertips and pull. And behind it was a hidden compartment. It was small, dusty, lined in velvet that had turned brown over time. And inside, a cloth pouch tied with a faded red ribbon. Charlotte stared at it for a long moment. She was suddenly aware of the silence in the room, how the ticking of the old kitchen clock downstairs had become deafening. She untied the ribbon with careful hands. Inside were 7 gold coins, each one no larger than a quarter, but clearly old, worn at the edges, stamped with dates she couldn't read without squinting. And there was something else, tucked beneath the pouch. A folded piece of paper. The handwriting was delicate, slanted, like it belonged to someone who still used fountain pens and linen stationery. To whoever finds this, please know this treasure was not meant to be hidden forever. If you found it, it means you were meant to. Please take care of the story as much as the gold. Charlotte sat back. She didn't know who had written it. She didn't know how long it had been there. But one thing was suddenly clear. This wasn't just a used dresser. It was the beginning of something far more valuable than gold. It was the beginning of a forgotten story. Charlotte didn't sleep that night. The coins sat on the kitchen table, wrapped again in the faded cloth. The note, now flattened between 2 cookbooks, kept pulling her eyes back. It wasn't just the treasure. It was the tone of the letter. Gentle, hopeful, like the writer knew someone would find it and trusted them with more than just gold. By mid-morning, curiosity outweighed hesitation. Charlotte pulled out her laptop and began to search. First gold coins with ribbon pouch and antique dresser, then coins hidden in Furniture, Ohio, nothing specific. She grabbed the letter again, hoping maybe she had missed a name. And then, just faintly, along the edge of the back fold, a signature. E. Alden. Not exactly a common name. She opened a new tab and typed E. Alden Millers Creek, Ohio. A few results popped up. A couple of obituaries, a church bulletin from 1998, then one article, a local piece from decades ago. Retired schoolteacher donates entire savings to local library. Name Eleanor Alden. Charlotte's breath caught. She clicked the article. A black and white photo loaded slowly. A woman in her 70s, kind eyes, thick glasses, smiling, holding a check in front of the town library. Eleanor Alden, retired second-grade teacher and lifelong resident of Millers Creek, surprised the town council by donating over $18,000 to expand the children's section of the public library. When asked about the source, she simply smiled and said, "It was something I'd been saving a long time, for the right moment." Charlotte stared at the photo. She looked familiar? Not in a "I've seen her before" kind of way, but in that deep, ancestral way, like someone who might have passed you on the street and smiled in a way that made you feel seen. She drove to the Millers Creek Library that afternoon. The librarian, a man in his 60s named Mr. Dorrance, perked up when she asked about Eleanor Alden. "Miss Alden," he said, almost surprised. "Goodness, haven't heard that name in years. She was a gem. Taught half this town's kids how to read. Why do you ask?" Charlotte hesitated, then decided to tell him the truth. She explained the dresser, the note, the coins, the hidden compartment. He listened with his full face leaning in, hand still on the counter like he was grounding himself. When she showed him the note, his eyes softened. "That looks like her handwriting. She always had a flourish with capital G's and J's." He left the desk for a few minutes and came back with a tattered file folder. Inside were photographs, library events, class photos, even handwritten thank you notes from former students. At the very bottom, a scan of a will. Eleanor had passed in 2001. No children, no known heirs. She lived alone in a little cottage on West Pine, Dorrance said. Most of her belongings were sold off years ago. Charlotte's heart skipped. "Do you know who bought the furniture?" He thought for a moment. "Actually, I think the Hensons lived next door. I remember they helped clear things out." It all connected. The yard sale, the dresser, the boy who said, "It's heavy, though." Charlotte returned to the Hensons' house the next day. Same driveway, same porch. A woman in her 40s answered the door. When Charlotte explained everything, the woman blinked in disbelief. "That old dresser, we've had that in the garage for ages. I think it came from Miss Alden's house." "Yeah, back when we helped clean out her place. Never thought it had anything in it." Charlotte held out the note. She meant for someone to find it. They sat on the porch together, passing the letter back and forth. There was no debate. The coins were valuable, but the story was priceless. "You should be the one to tell it," the woman said. "Ms. Alden would have liked that." That night, Charlotte placed the pouch back into the hidden compartment, not to hide it, but to protect it, just as Eleanor had. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was part of something that mattered. Not because of the gold, but because someone, decades before, had believed in the power of being remembered. Charlotte wasn't quite sure what to do next. The coins and Eleanor's note had already taken her on a journey she never expected. But something inside her, maybe the teacher in her, maybe the daughter still grieving her mother, told her the story wasn't finished. It wasn't about gold. It wasn't even about the woman who'd hidden it. It was about why. The next weekend, Charlotte returned to Eleanor Alden's old cottage on West Pine Street. It sat quiet, untouched in that strange way only old homes are not abandoned, but paused, like the air inside was still waiting for someone to finish a sentence. She stood on the sidewalk for a long time. Then, almost instinctively, she stepped off the curb, walked up to the door, and gently knocked. No one answered, of course. It had been empty for years. But the woman from the Henson family, Marie, had given her a spare key. We still check in now and then. She'd said, just to make sure the pipes don't burst in winter. Charlotte unlocked the door. The scent hit her first. Dust, lavender, and something faintly sweet like old perfume trapped in wood grain. The furniture was gone, but the energy remained. She walked slowly through the front room, brushing her fingers along the windowsill, imagining Eleanor standing there, watching children pass by with backpacks slung over one shoulder. In the back of the house was what appeared to be Eleanor's study. A narrow room with a single window, a small bookshelf still half full, and a built-in desk tucked under the eave. Charlotte sat down in the old wooden chair. It creaked softly beneath her. The top drawer slid open easily. Empty. She tried the others. Some jammed. One held an old pair of glasses. And then she noticed a tiny panel in the back corner of the lowest drawer. It was covered in the same cherry-stained veneer as the desk, almost invisible, unless you were looking for it. Charlotte pressed her thumb gently against it. Click! Her breath caught. Behind the panel was a slim wooden box, no bigger than a shoebox. Inside, a second note. Folded clean, tied with twine. She opened it, hands trembling. To the one who found the coins, thank you for listening. If you're holding this, then maybe, just maybe, you understand why I hid them. It was never about value. It was about story, about memory. Each of those coins was given to me by someone who meant something, a student, a friend, a man I loved. Once. People don't always get monuments. Sometimes they only get small things, and those small things deserve to be honored. If you found this, I ask you one favor, don't spend them. Tell their story instead. It was signed, again, Eleanor Alden. But this time, beneath her name, in slightly smaller handwriting. If you want to know the real treasure, it's in the books. Charlotte looked up slowly at the small bookshelf. 3 shelves, dusty, uneven. But tucked between 2 old mystery novels was something that didn't quite fit a leather-bound notebook, worn at the edges, tied closed with a satin ribbon. She pulled it out, untied it, and opened to the first page. The coin stories. Each page was labeled with a name. One page read, Tommy, age 9, gave me a gold coin from his pirate birthday party because I was the only adult who showed up. Another, Lucille, fellow teacher, gave me a coin before moving to California, said it was for luck in love, which I never had. And one more. David, he was going to ask me to marry him, but the letter came from the army instead. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. This wasn't treasure. This was a living archive of human connection. A love letter to all the lives Eleanor had quietly touched, and all the people who had quietly touched hers. She sat there for hours, reading, weeping, smiling, and by sunset, she knew exactly what she had to do next. This story didn't belong to her. It belonged to everyone who ever left a piece of themselves behind in a drawer, in a book, in a life, and Eleanor Alden. She wasn't forgotten anymore. Charlotte hadn't expected her life to change from a $15 dresser. But as she held Eleanor Alden's journal, The Coin Stories, it was as if the world had shifted under her feet. These weren't just coins. They were memories, sealed in time by a woman who'd loved, lost, taught, and waited all without fanfare or recognition. Charlotte felt something stir deep inside her. For months after her mother's passing, she'd felt like a ghost in her own life existing, but not fully living. Grief had left her numb, quiet. She'd gone through the motions, ate when she had to, smiled when expected. But inside, empty, until now. Because somewhere between those yellowed pages and ribbon-tied memories, she'd found herself feeling again. That evening, she placed the journal back inside the wooden box and took it home. She made a cup of tea, chamomile, her mother's favorite, and sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open. She began typing. Not to publish anything, not yet. Just to preserve, to honor, to make sure the ink on those fragile pages didn't disappear before it could be shared. She started with Tommy, then Lucille, then David. As she typed, she imagined their faces, the way they might have smiled when handing Eleanor those coins, the moments that must have mattered enough for her to write them down. By midnight, she had transcribed 10 stories, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Charlotte felt connected to something bigger than herself. Over the next week, she returned to the library, spoke again with Mr. Dorrance, shared what she had found. He listened with the reverence of someone receiving sacred history. "She used to sit right over there," he said, pointing to an old armchair in the reading corner, always with a book in her lap and that same quiet smile. He leaned forward. "You know, we've been talking about starting a community oral history project. Would you consider reading some of these stories aloud, recording them?" Charlotte blinked. "Me? Yes, you." He smiled. "You're already doing what we hoped someone would, giving forgotten voices a chance to be heard." She hesitated. She was a teacher. Yes, a reader, certainly, but a storyteller. Still, something about it felt right. 2 weeks later, Charlotte sat in the library's tiny sound booth, a pair of headphones resting gently over her ears. She took a breath, opened to the first page of the journal, and pressed record. Tommy was 9 when he gave me the gold coin. He called it pirate treasure, and he had a missing front tooth and a chocolate stain on his shirt. I was the only adult who came to his birthday party, and when he handed me the coin, he whispered, "You're the bravest grown-up I know." Her voice cracked slightly at the end. But she kept reading. Story after story, life after life. People who had slipped through time without notice now remembered, now immortalized. Within a month, the library launched the Coin Stories podcast, and to their surprise, people began listening. First from Miller's Creek, then from nearby towns. Then letters started arriving, emails, handwritten notes, even small packages. My grandmother used to tell stories like this. "I found something similar in my dad's toolbox. This made me cry. Thank you." Charlotte was stunned. She had thought this was just Eleanor's story. But now, she saw this was everyone's story. We all leave behind pieces of ourselves, not always on purpose, not always with explanation, but in drawers, boxes, notebooks, and hearts. And sometimes, if we're lucky, someone like Charlotte finds them and cares enough to tell them out loud. That night, after recording 3 new episodes, Charlotte stood by the kitchen window, mug in hand. The gold coins still sat safely in their velvet pouch, resting beside the journal. She hadn't moved them. She hadn't needed to. Their value wasn't in what they were made of. It was in what they carried. And as she looked out into the quiet night, something her mother once said floated back to her. Some treasures you spend, but the best ones you pass on. Charlotte smiled. She finally understood what that meant. Charlotte never set out to change lives. All she had done was follow a sound, a faint, unexpected click, and open a drawer. And yet, somehow, that small act had grown into something far greater than she ever imagined. The Coin Stories podcast had quietly gained traction, Nothing viral, nothing flashy, just steady. People listened, people remembered, people felt, and they began sending in their own stories. Some were handwritten in cursive, others were recorded on phones, whispered from hospital beds or back porches or late-night living rooms. They came from all over Nebraska, Vermont, Arizona, even one from Nova Scotia. Each one began the same way. I don't know if this is worth sharing, but this story's always stayed with me, even if no one else remembers. There's this drawer I never opened until now. Charlotte read every single one, and something in her shifted again. She no longer saw Eleanor's journal as a closed chapter. It was a spark one that had caught fire across generations, across strangers, across time. One afternoon, she received a call from the local high school. "Miss Ellenwood, we heard about your podcast," the principal said. "We were wondering if you'd be willing to speak at our creative writing class." Charlotte hesitated. "I'm not really a speaker." "That's okay," he replied. "You're a storyteller." So she went. She stood in front of 20 restless teenagers in hoodies and oversized headphones, and instead of lecturing, she played them one of Eleanor's stories. At first, the room was quiet in that distracted, skeptical way. Then something changed. A girl in the front row began to cry silently. A boy in the back took off his headphones. One by one, they leaned in, not out of obligation, but out of connection. Charlotte finished the story and looked up. "Everyone leaves something behind," she said. "Not always coins, sometimes just a sentence, a gesture, a quiet moment that matters more than we realize. And maybe it's not our job to write a masterpiece, but just to notice when someone else has..." After class, a student named Ava approached her. She was quiet, holding a beat-up composition notebook against her chest. "I write stories too," she whispered, "but I never thought they mattered." Charlotte smiled and said the most honest thing she knew. "They do." Ava handed her the notebook. Inside were stories not polished, not perfect, but honest. Raw, alive. One about her brother who used to sing her to sleep before his deployment. Another about the last letter her grandmother wrote before her memory faded. Charlotte asked if she could read one on the podcast. Ava nodded, wide-eyed. That week's episode was titled Ava's Story. It wasn't from Eleanor's journal. It wasn't decades old. It was a 15-year-old girl's memory, told with the same weight, the same heart, the same unshakable truth. And listeners responded, not because Ava was famous, but because she was real. And in that honesty, people saw their own families, their own losses, their own small treasures. Charlotte didn't know it yet. But this was the new opportunity, not just to preserve Eleanor's legacy, but to build a bridge between past and present, old and young, forgotten and found. The podcast grew into a monthly library event. Found and shared true-ish stories worth keeping. People came. Some read aloud. Some just listened. One woman brought a tin box full of postcards from a stranger she once loved but never met. Charlotte didn't need to explain the value. Everyone already knew. Because in a world that moves too fast, where so many voices get drowned out, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is sit still and listen. Back home, the dresser remained in the guest room. Still scratched, still sturdy, and in the hidden compartment, tucked beneath the velvet pouch. Charlotte placed a new note. Her own. It read, "If you're reading this, thank you. You found more than a story. You found a connection. Please, keep it going." She signed it simply C.E., and for the first time in a long, long time she felt at peace. Not because she'd found treasure, but because she'd learned to share it. 6 months had passed. The guest room, once quiet and unused, had become Charlotte's sanctuary, a place where voices long forgotten were brought back to life. She still kept the dresser in the same corner, right beneath the old lace-curtained window, not because of its value, but because of what it had unlocked in her and in others. What began with a hidden drawer had grown into something far more powerful than gold, or even legacy. Charlotte was no longer just a woman trying to move through grief. She had become something she'd never dared call herself before a storyteller. Every Tuesday, she walked to the library with a thermos of tea, the old leather journal tucked under one arm, and sometimes a new notebook with scribbled stories from strangers she hadn't met yet. The Coin Stories podcast had grown from a local curiosity to something quietly profound. One of her episodes had been played during a veterans memorial in Kansas. Another was used in a college writing seminar about the power of memory. And just last week, a teacher from Oregon sent in a recording from her 5th grade class, a chorus of tiny voices saying, "Thank you." Charlotte listened to it alone in her car, tears welling up as she gripped the steering wheel. "Thank you for keeping their stories alive," one child had said. "I hope someone remembers mine someday." It was that line, soft, innocent, that stayed with her. She began to think about her mother, too, not just in grief but in gratitude. Her mother had been a quiet woman, a gardener, a tea drinker, a journal keeper. After the funeral, Charlotte hadn't had the strength to go through her things. Now, months later, she felt ready. That Saturday, she opened the cedar chest at the foot of her mother's bed. Inside were old birthday cards, photographs, and to her surprise, 5 notebooks, tied with faded ribbon. She opened the top one. The handwriting was unmistakable. Charlotte's first word today was apple. Not perfect, more like ap-puh, but still. She was so proud. She clapped for herself. "I laughed so hard I cried." Charlotte smiled through the tears. Her mother had been a storyteller, too, just in a quieter, more personal way. And now, it was her turn to carry that voice forward. She started a new segment on the podcast called The Second Drawer. Where Eleanor's drawer had been the first treasure, this would be the second stories found in homes, attics, closets, in the everyday places people overlook. She shared her mother's journal entries, carefully, respectfully. The audience responded immediately. "I never thought my mom's recipes were stories, but now I see that they are. I started recording my dad telling stories after dinner. Thank you for reminding me that his voice matters. You made me go call my grandmother. I hadn't spoken to her in years." Charlotte wasn't chasing viral fame. She didn't care for applause. But she had discovered something stronger, resonance. A quiet knowing that what she was doing mattered not for the masses, but for the ones who needed it. In that growth, Charlotte also found healing. Where grief once silenced her, now there was space for reflection. Where loneliness once echoed, now there was a community. She even started teaching a free workshop at the library every second Thursday. How to tell a story that feels like home. People came with letters, with photos, with nothing but a memory and a willingness to share. Charlotte listened and helped them shape their pieces not into perfection, but into truth. Because she had learned something Eleanor Alden had known all along. It's not the treasure that matters. It's the one who finds it and decides to pass it on. One evening, just before sunset, Charlotte returned to the guest room. She opened the hidden compartment one last time. Not to hide something, but to add to it. She slipped in a new note. It read, "To whoever finds this next, you're holding more than wood and velvet. You're holding voices. If you're still enough, you'll hear them. And maybe one day, your voice will join them." She closed the drawer quietly, and this time, there was no click, no surprise, just a sense of peace. She stood by the window, watched the light shift through the trees, and whispered softly, "Thank you, Eleanor, for everything. The podcast now had over 100,000 listeners. Not because of marketing, not because of algorithms or sponsors, but because one voice had echoed far enough for others to answer. It started with Eleanor, passed through Charlotte, and then rippled outward through a teenager's journal in Iowa, an old man's love letters in Montana, a retired nurse's voice memo from a beach house in Maine. People began sharing again. Not for likes, not for followers, but to be heard, to be remembered. On a cold Sunday morning in early December, Charlotte stood in front of the small-town auditorium. A hand-painted banner read, "The Coin Stories Lev." Rows of folding chairs stretched out beneath soft lights. The smell of coffee and cinnamon muffins filled the air. Children sat beside their grandparents. Old high school friends hugged after decades apart. It wasn't a performance, it was a gathering. Charlotte stepped onto the makeshift stage, microphone in hand, and took a long breath. She wasn't nervous, not anymore. She looked out over the faces and smiled. I used to think stories had to be perfect, that they had to start with once upon a time and end with something big and dramatic. But the more I read, the more I listened, the more I learned this simple truth: the most powerful stories are the quiet ones, the ones told at kitchen tables, in handwritten notes, in drawers we almost never open. She paused, then held up Eleanor's original note, the one that started it all. This wasn't written for a stage. It was written for someone like you, someone willing to listen. The crowd stayed silent, but their silence was full, not empty. Some wept. Some smiled through tears. A young woman in the front row held her mother's hand like it was the last safe place in the world. Then Charlotte did something unexpected. She opened her palm and held out one of Eleanor's coins. "This coin is one of 7, but tonight I'm letting one go." A quiet murmur passed through the crowd. Not because its story is over, but because it needs to keep moving, like all stories do. She walked down from the stage, slowly, and placed the coin into the hands of a teenage boy sitting next to an older woman. His grandmother, perhaps. "Tell your story," she whispered. "When you're ready, pass it on." The boy didn't say anything, just nodded, eyes wide, and in that moment, Charlotte saw it clearly. Eleanor's legacy wasn't gold. It was courage. To remember, to speak, to listen. Back home that night, Charlotte lit a single candle in the guest room, the kind her mother used to light on snowy evenings. She sat at the dresser, her dresser, now, and opened a brand new notebook. This time, not to transcribe someone else's story, but to write her own. She wrote about grief, about silence, about the healing that came not in grand epiphanies, but in small, steady steps. And as the flame flickered beside her, she realized something. The real treasure wasn't in the hidden drawer. It was in the quiet choice to open it. So if you ever find yourself holding something old, a letter, a photograph, a dresser at a yard sale, take a moment. Be still. Listen, because you never know whose voice is waiting to be heard next. Charlotte didn't find fame. She didn't stumble upon riches. She found a handful of old coins, a journal, and a woman's quiet legacy. But what she truly uncovered was a forgotten truth in this fast-moving world. Every life holds value and every story deserves to be told. Some are tucked away in velvet pouches behind old drawers, and some are waiting patiently for someone kind enough to notice them. In choosing to listen, Charlotte healed her own wounds, and in sharing what she found, she gave others permission to do the same. If this story moved you, subscribe for more quiet, powerful stories. And if you know someone who believes memories matter, share this with them. Sometimes, opening the smallest drawer reveals the biggest truth.